Buddy, my name is Wendy Schiller. I'm a professor of political science, and I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. We have an amazing panel today that I will introduce as a group and then introduce them as they come up to the podium to give their remarks, to reflect on midterm 2022. You know, what we expected, what we didn't expect, what surprised us. I want to leave plenty of room and time for questions. The event runs from 5 to 6 p.m. So I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for about 7-ish minutes. And then we'll try to open it up for questions. And if there's a vacuum, I can always think of a few questions. So we are going to start. I'll just introduce the panelists, and then I'll tell you who we'll start with. Professor Richard Arenberg. Some of you might have Professor Arenberg now or have had him for a class. He's a professor of the practice and has had a career of more than 35 years, I believe, as a senior staff member in the United States Senate. We have Professor Catherine Tate, who is an acclaimed expert in public opinion and African American politics and the United States Congress. We have Professor Jonathan Collins, who's jointly appointed in the Watson Institute and the Education Department, who studies representation, inequality, and educational policy. You can come on in, and if you have to leave, you have to leave. Don't worry, just come on in. You can sit in the front and then leave. Oh. And we have Paul Testa, who's an assistant professor of political science, who also specializes in public opinion, quantitative methods, and studying the criminal justice system and attitudes about criminal justice. So we have a terrific lineup today, as I've just said, and we're going to start with Professor Catherine Tate, who I'm going to invite up to the podium, where she'll speak, and then we'll proceed to Professor Jonathan Collins and Professor Testa, and we'll close with Professor Arenberg.
A writer in the Washington Post said that the 2022 midterm elections were the most consequential in our lifetime. That writer, Eugene Robinson, goes on to say that half of the Republicans running for major offices were election deniers. Writing a week before the election, Republicans were expected to win majority control of Congress in 2022. They fell short of that goal, it might seem, for the Senate, and but it looks like they'll probably succeed in winning majority control for the House. So this looked more alarming a week ago in terms for Democrats who were concerned about Republican takeover. But the agendas of the two parties are so polarized that voters really care about which party controls Congress now. Before, midterm elections used to be, forgettable affairs. People really didn't participate much in them, and now, we have these super consequential elections that we're all, motivated to vote for because the parties are so different today than they used to be. Democrats had governed without Republicans under Biden for the most part, and the likely speaker, Kevin McCarthy, has pledged to do the same. So once he's speaker, he's going to govern without the Democrats. He's also going to push a Trump-like agenda, and that includes score settling with an impeachment vote on Biden, is what's probably going to be scheduled. Trump himself is expected to announce his presidential bid for 2024 on November 15th. And surveys reveal that most voters in the United States don't want a rematch of 2020 and 2024. So there's a September 2022 Harvard CAPS Harris poll. About 2/3 of the voters surveyed, 67% said Biden shouldn't seek another term as president. And they said one reason why is that they just consider him to be a bad president. About 50% said that. Another 30% said that it's because Biden would be 84 then. Trump, meanwhile, doesn't fare much better when it comes to running in 2024 either. About 57% said that the former president shouldn't mount another bid for the White House. When it comes to reasons why, they were split. About 1/3 said that they think that he's erratic. Another third said that he'll divide the country. And then another third said, or 31% said, that it was his role in the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol is why they don't think he should be run for president again in 2024. 60% of those surveys said that they wanted a moderate candidate for president in 2024. So we're looking at the midterms results, and they're putting us on track for more extremism from both parties, it seems, but particularly from the Republican Party, which Speaker McCarthy's already pledged to have these investigations and impeach some Democratic officials, including probably the president. And Trump is getting ready to announce early his election plan next week. So I think, it just remains concerning that 2022 was a concerning election, 2020 was a concerning election, and 2024 is going to be a concerning election. What struck me about the elections this year on a different track is that the 2020 elections made the 117th Congress the most racially diverse ever to date, and the diversity is going to continue with the 118th Congress. While the two black female Democrats didn't win their Senate races, there's some remarkable newcomers to Congress. Maxwell Frost, a black Democrat from Florida, is exactly 25 years of age, at the age required to be elected to the House. There's Summer Lee, a state representative who won her Democratic primary in an open seat race. She defeated a rival who had the party's backing and lots of money in that primary. And she's expected to join the squad, the progressive group of Democrats that have voted several times now against party-backed bills in defiance. So she's somebody who's going to, I think, be someone to watch in the 118th Congress. Given the tragic assault of Pelosi's husband, Pelosi has hinted that she might not serve as leader in the next Congress. It's a possibility. And there's already a group of young Congress people who want the number 1, number 2, number 3 spots from Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn. And I think that if there is a reorganization of the Democratic Party in the 118th Congress, this might push us away some from the Trump world that we're going to be entering into because of McCarthy's leadership as the next Speaker of the House. From work that I've done and others, the inclusion of women and minorities helped liberalize the Democratic Party. So we saw what's striking about 2022 is a record number of blacks have run as Republicans. And while only a few have won right now, Wesley Hunt won in Texas, John James is leading in Michigan, George Logan is losing in Connecticut, but barely. So, by tomorrow, it's not clear whether they truly lost or truly won, but we know that one of them has won, in addition to the 3 that are already black Republicans that are already serving in the Congress. We'll see some more. And I think that these elections are going to help direct the party away from its anti-black politics, although these black Republicans are not necessarily more pro-women, pro-LGBTQ, or pro-immigrant than regular Republicans. But I think black Republicans like Senator Tim Scott, who's expected to run for president in 2024, are not prominent Trumpers. And so I think that I'm going to say that what's striking to me is that the new diversity in the Republican Party is going to move us away from Trumpism, is what I predict. And I think that it's something noteworthy to look at. When we look at women, though, women having helped liberalize the Democratic Party, I have another claim that Republican women who are moderates are generally gone in Congress. We're waiting to see if Murkowski is going to be able to survive a challenge to her Senate seat in Alaska, and it's just too close to tell, but she might not. And so Republican women in the post-Dobbs world are expected to vote party line, which means that, no, they're not going to help necessarily liberalize the Republican Party, unlike I think the racial minorities are. And I think that what's happened to Republican women right now is that as they've sought advancement as leaders, they've pledged their souls to the Republican Party. But it's been pointed out to me that Democratic women are party line voters too, but we still see a grouping of mostly women, the squad, working in defiance of the party, pushing the party to become more liberal from the outside in some ways that we don't see within the Republican Party. One of the noteworthy events in the Republican Party was that 11 of them have voted against Marjorie Taylor Greene's, voted for Marjorie Taylor Greene to be removed from her committee assignments. 11 Republicans voted with them, and 3 of those 11 were minority Republican women. In fact, they were the only women to vote for Greene's removal. And these 3 women, Young Kim of California, Maria Salazar of Florida, Nicholas Miliotakis is half Cuban, of New York, might get punished actually for their votes, because Greene is expected to be restored, have her committee assignments restored under McCarthy's leadership. And in this sort of Trump era of score settling, their votes might be held against them in terms of their opportunities to push their agendas as Republican women in the 118th Congress. So I do think that women in the new Congress are not necessarily going to be transformative leaders, Republican women, but women have been transformative leaders in the past. But I think in the new Congress, we're not going to see Republican women take a leadership role. There's Nancy Mance of South Carolina, who talks about compromising on abortion politics. And for her, a compromise is that to have a national ban with exceptions for rape and incest. And I don't see that as meeting in the middle or compromising. So I think that's more just talk. So I think that the Republican women are going to vote party line on an abortion ban, and we won't see what we've had in the past, moderate Republican women dissenting on anti-abortion politics. Lastly, I want to talk about the Latinx vote in 2022. While Latinx voters are decidedly Democratic, we saw a growing minority are voting Republican. I think that the Democrats have been given a wake-up call. This was a party that once took black votes for granted, but no more. I don't think they I think there's a closer relationship between black voters and the Democratic Party today, and that is been a new development that has continued. So we'll see the party work harder to secure the Latinx vote now. I think only one Latina won her election as a Republican so far. I think the others, I think the other ones have all lost, but, you know, again, this is, I have to verify that later, but that was, the one who won was in Florida. Anna Paulina Luna, Florida won as a Latina Republican. And again, I think that she's going to make a difference for the Republican Party with that new diversity, that the ethnic and racial diversity in that party. So I think Republicans will have an advantage with the Latinx community today because of their new diversity. And I think, again, that this diversity within the GOP will counter Trumpism. I think in general that the racial transformation of Congress is really an important development, a really noteworthy development of the 21st century. So.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Professor Jonathan Collins.
All right. I want to thank Professor Schiller, the director of the Taubman Center, for creating the space for the conversation. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues who I have the fortune of being on this panel alongside, Professor Ehrenberg, Professor Tate, Professor Testa. I'll get into my reactions to the title of this event, which is this seemingly small but very large question of what's next. It's a short question, but it's a very heavy one. I'm going to work through. I'm going to basically use this as an exercise to sort of work through how I sort of work through processing the election, the results. I guess like from the political scientist perspective. One of the things that we're taught very early on is that when it comes to elections, main driver of elections, right? Vote share, the economy, right? That's the classic line, Carville, it's the economy, stupid. It's a very interesting time to be thinking about the role of the economy in dictating the outcome of elections, because these are very unusual economic times. And I feel like that wasn't necessarily discussed as much during the campaigns, but it's the reality. So again, economy usually drives the electoral expectations. If you look at the predictive models that you'll find, 538, you look at a modeler that I like to follow, Drew Linzer, but he's a UCLA PhD, so I'm a little biased. You'll find GDP, usually one of the primary variables in the model, unemployment rate, change in household income. There's usually some sort of squabble happening over which economic predictor is the one that's sort of leading the charge in terms of allowing us to get a sense of where we see these forecast models sort of winning out. But again, weird economic moment. So GDP, steady incline. Unemployment rate, 3.5%, very low. Jobs added last quarter, 250,000, 250,000. So by traditional indicators, the economy is relatively strong. On one hand, though, there's how the economy performs, and then there's how people experience the economy, right? How the economy feels to us. And so, to a lot of people, the economy doesn't feel as the indicators suggest. This creates the interesting paradox here. So you have what people are experiencing, labor shortage, right? Which I'd like to sort of call corporate greed, because we could just pay people more, right? But this quote unquote labor shortage has created higher costs for everything. We have sky high interest rates that form a huge wall for anyone who needs a loan. And so we have an economic moment when almost everyone has a job, but then nobody can afford to buy anything. And so if you look at exit surveys, you find views toward the economy to be pretty much partisan. There's no clear bipartisan understanding of what the economy looks like. A part of this, I argue, is because of this kind of weird, wonky sort of economic time. Another part, as you'll see, is this deep level of polarization that continues to protrude through some of the more quote-unquote obvious political indicators. And so one of the things that I really like about election season is exit surveys, right? The good thing about exit surveys, so we don't really have great data on voters, right? Like we have public opinion surveys that circulate through throughout the year. You'll see that CNN does a national survey. We as social scientists conduct surveys all the time. Do we know who we're surveying? Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Do we trust the next poll that comes from ABC News, NBC News? Sure, right? Law of averages, right? We should. But if there's anything that the 2022 election, the 2020 presidential election called into question, the 2016 election called into question, is like what we can learn from surveys leading up to the election, right? A lot of us were just kind of like struck by the discrepancy between what we were seeing in polls leading up to the election and, of course, that election outcome. But exit surveys are a great opportunity to find out what voters really think, because we know we're surveying voters. These are people who just went into the polling station, voted, and on the way out, there's usually somebody probably about your age tracking them down and asking them to fill out the survey. So I think it's really interesting data. So I was looking at the CNN exit survey. I just slandered CNN, and now I'm using their survey. But it was great because they had over 18,000 respondents, which is a really, really large sample size, and I think really, really useful information as a function of that. And so what we see is only 23% of Americans believe the economy is in quote-unquote good shape. 88% of those who do believe this are Democrats. Of the 76% of Americans who believe that the economy is in poor condition, 62% are Republicans. Again, clear partisan divide here. Only 19% of Americans feel that they're better off economically than they were 2 years ago. 88% of those are Democrats. Less than 1% of those are the people who invested in cryptocurrency. not an actual statistic, but it probably is true. So we're in this weird economic time. And so if it really is the economy stupid, it's all about the economy given the party you root for. So maybe the story of the midterms is actually the sort of usual story of partisans being partisans, in terms of like what our takeaway is. There is ample evidence to support this claim. If you look throughout the beloved exit survey, you find very clear partisan splits on pretty much every salient political issue that could have factored into voters' minds heading into the ballot box. Now, however, there is interestingly bipartisan agreement on one thing I could find some kind of bipartisan agreement on was views toward democracy. Both Democrats and Republicans, as respective groups, were split down the middle pretty much in terms of whether they view American democracy as secure versus under threat. So about 50-ish% believe that democracy is secure, about 50-ish% believe democracy is under threat, and it's pretty clean for both Democrats and Republicans. So there is at least bipartisan support or bipartisan agreement that the other party is ruining democracy. There are other issues that are not exactly bipartisan, but we have more agreement than we might expect, and I think this is really interesting and useful for sort of dissecting what we've been seeing. So remember the George Floyd murder? Right. It doesn't feel like people still do. Like it seems like people kind of forgot about that. If you think about this, like the way that sort of our racial politics kind of feels in this country and in this moment. Yet, racism in the U.S., still over half of Americans considered it a major problem. And again, you could find somewhat sizable subpopulations across partisan divides. So 75% of the folks who believe that racism in the U.S. is a major problem identify as Democrats, 25% identified as Republicans. Was this a big question coming in, too, with all the election deniers, right? Was this election a referendum on the integrity of elections? More pointedly, were voters mobilized by the claim of election fraud? I thought this was a particularly interesting question. The idea of showing up to vote because you believe that the election system is fraudulent is a really interesting concept to me. It seems like if I thought the elections were fraudulent, I wouldn't vote and participate in said process. So how much of this is actually real? It's kind of real. But so about 80% of Americans express confidence, though, in the fairness of state elections. So despite all of the media coverage of candidates being explicitly a sort of election deniers, it seems like voters in and of themselves were, on average, not following suit of the political stances of the elite. So 42% of those expressing this idea were Republicans. Of the 80% who felt that elections were safe, 42% of those were Republicans, 56% were Democrats. The thing I want to also mention is abortion. So we've been through a lot with abortion in a very small amount of time. You have, not only did the Supreme Court strike down Roe v. Wade, there was real pressure, like real political pressure from the Republican Party to institute a federal abortion ban. Like this was on the table. There were bills being written to make this happen. Like this was a firm possibility, still is a firm possibility with the House being under threat here. And so, but as it turns out, abortion access is a very important political issue, and then not just for Democrats. 60% of voters think abortion should be legal. A quarter of those are Republican voters. A majority of voters think abortion should be legal in at least some cases. This includes about 40% of Republicans. Abortion behind inflation was what voters identified as the most important issue heading into this election. 23% of the voters who saw abortion as the primary issue, Republicans. This helps explain why pro-choice ballot measures passed California, Vermont, Kentucky, I think, Michigan. So this is not just a situation, this is a situation where there's an interesting distance between the kind of political project aimed at dismantling abortion and the fact that abortion rights are publicly popular amongst the American public, but then also in a way that is not cleanly bipartisan. But there seems to be more support for abortion rights amongst the Republican voters than the Republican leadership. And that's an interesting takeaway, an important takeaway, I think, from this election. Lingering questions, and then I'll go. So the upshot is that there's nothing unusual happening in these results, despite this being such an unusual time. Remember the pandemic? We were inside for like months, and that was 2 years ago. Like this is the first midterm election since the world ended, right? Like this is a very, very unusual time. I know like it's normalized because the cookies are delicious, but this is a very unusual time. Yet we still see results that are indicative of what we consider a quote unquote normal time. So is this a time to breathe a sigh of relief or renew an appetite for more transformative governance and policy reform? How should we feel about this particular moment? What are the remaining questions? This is also quietly a referendum on voter suppression. Again, we haven't seen official national turnout levels, voter turnout level data yet. They're starting to trickle in from some states. And again, what I've seen so far is that there hasn't been a major spike or decline in voter turnout. It seems to be hitting around that high 40s, low 50s area that you tend to see in midterm elections. I'm not seeing anything unusual here. Do the normal turnout levels suggest that the suppression tactics didn't work? We shall see. How much of this is being counterbalanced by the fact that the pandemic also forced a lot of states to make voting easier? We've seen an uptick. While we haven't seen necessarily any kind of surge in overall voter turnout, we have seen a change in the voter distribution. So more people are voting by mail, more people are voting early. And so is this counteracting the voter suppression tactics? Should we be on the lookout for new voter suppression tactics that attacked these new modes of voting? We'll see. Either way, this distracts us from our quest for uniformly high voter turnout. We're happy with the 48%. We should still be hungry for more. We should still be hungry for uniform 100% voter turnout, even in this particular moment. And what can we do to make voting easier and more accessible? What do we do about the nationalization of American politics? Is this a problem? Is it a problem that attack ads that you'll see on television for a congressional race for someone who will represent you in your respective area is primarily framing opponents as a member and supporter of the opposite party and someone who will vote with a party along party lines as a member of Congress, as opposed to talking about how Congress can impact more localized issues. And then the last question, what's at stake here? I'm an education policy person, so I'm gonna put my thumb on the scale a little bit. Heading into the election, there was a lot of conversation about the anti-CRT movement. That eerily died down like a week before. Like you just do a Google search. You can't really find anything about CRT within the last week. It's incredible. That doesn't mean that the push through different state legislatures to discredit and really erase our ability to talk about race and identity in the educational setting is going away. The politicization of test scores and student achievement, I won't say more. Governor McKee might hear me. And then, of course, the big affirmative action case, which affects us here in the higher education setting in particular. There are real reasons, I'm close, there are real reasons for us as a campus community to closely monitor to the title of the event, What's Next?
Thank you very much. Okay, next up is Professor Paul Testa.
Thanks so much, Wendy. I suppose the immediate answer to the question of what's next is a disappointment, because it's very hard to follow my colleagues Catherine and Jonathan, really. But thank you. More broadly, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming out this night after the election to talk about what's next. And so I'll structure my comments and responses and thoughts sort of broadly up front with it, just some sort of general kind of good night, bad night framings of what happened last night. Then I'll turn to the question of what this means specifically for next Congress, some members of Congress that I would watch going forward, and then what this means specifically for 2024. So broadly, I would say, given our expectations coming into the night, yesterday was a good night for Democrats and a roughly bad night for Republicans. Just my sense, we're still counting votes, but the state of play is the Senate is most likely 50-50. A lot depends on three races. Democrats need to win 2 out of 3 in Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. I think that's correct, right? So they win 2 of those. They have a 50 majority in the Senate with Kamala Harris casting the deciding vote. And in Nevada, I think we are still waiting on mail votes from Clark County and Washoe County, so it will likely be a while. In Arizona, again, it's down to Pima and Maricopa, also going to be a while, so several days before we'll sort of know those races. And Georgia is headed to a runoff, where I think, the sort of big question is perhaps how Walker does without sort of a more popular candidate like Kemp on the ballot, right? So I think that Kemp certainly outperformed Walker in the overall race, and so this is, I think, a point that Jonathan brought up. I guess I think you're right that the elections in general have become increasingly nationalized, but I do think that 2022 in some ways was potentially a good night for split ticket voting, or at least the death of split ticket voting is not quite complete, right? That we did see some drop off, and those small margins in competitive races can matter a lot. And so Georgia is, I think, one place where we've seen that. And so the question of how Walker does versus Warnock in that special election, I think depends a lot on what happens in Nevada and Arizona, right? That if this is a decisive race for control of the Senate, then I think that becomes much more a nationalized election. Whereas if it is, deciding between 50 and 51, then I think that perhaps the sort of support, I think the support is higher for Warnock than among Warnock supporters are, I think, more enthusiastic than Walker's, and so that might change the dynamics of that race. But stepping back, sort of coming back to our sort of expectations, right? I think you heard a lot in the sort of narrative lead up to election night about the potential for a red wave, right? That potentially that this would be sort of overwhelming support for Republicans. And I think if you turn to those fundamentals that Jonathan brought up about the economy, about presidential approval, about history, right? That's what the fundamentals would lead us to expect, right? The inflation is high, gas prices are high, GDP growth is sluggish, unemployment. Presidents traditionally in their midterms lose seats, governing presidents traditionally lose seats, and then there are sort of structural reasons why we think maybe Republicans have a sort of advantage at the sort of district level, where we would expect them to pick up seats, right? And so why didn't that happen? And my sense is that there are sort of broadly, I would suggest sort of two broad answers, right? One is that sort of candidates matter, right? Candidate quality matters a lot. And I think one of the dynamics we've seen is the sort of, with the sort of rise of Trump and MAGA politics, are the types of candidates that appeal to sort of a Republican primary base are different than those that would appeal to the general election. And I think we saw that play out multiple places across both Senate and House races last night. Oz in Pennsylvania, Bolduc in New Hampshire. There was some consideration about sort of Democratic National Committees sort of spending races to support more extreme Republican candidates, and I think there's some critique of that, right? That I haven't checked all of the races, but at least in New Hampshire, that bet seems to have paid off, right? That the Democratic candidates did better against these more extreme sort of Republican outliers, right? So candidate quality matters, right? I think that's one thing that we learned, that it's not just about fundamentals. And then as Jonathan really more expertly than I could have mentioned, issues matter, right? I think it's certainly clear that abortion played a big role. We saw that in the special elections leading up to midterm election. I think the sort of general kind of dissatisfaction with kind of a Trump-style MAGA politics, democracy is on the ballot. That was a message that we heard from Biden in the sort of lead up to the election that I think some question its efficacy. And in the exit polls, we do see that sort of reflected as a concern expressed by voters. I would offer one caveat about exit polls is that very early on, while we're still counting votes, it's sort of hard to know. These are often unweighted, and so they can lead to proportions of turnout that are sort of impossible above 100%. And so I think the points that Jonathan made, I think generally hold true. But I think if you want to know the final numbers, it will take a while. Like everything in this election, it'll take some while. So some caveats there. So another sort of area where I think that we have sort of a good night is for traditional polling. That I think one of the sort of questions and concerns that I, as someone who does a lot of public opinion research, who cares a lot about what polls can tell us and whether polls are valid measures of democracy and valid tools for sort of democratic governance, there was a concern that polls were fundamentally broken, right? And this narrative, I think, it's perhaps useful to sort of understand the origins of this narrative. And I think it starts in part with perhaps the relative performance of polls predicting the electoral outcomes in 2008 and 2012, right? That we have this sort of, with the advent and rise of 538 of election forecasting of polling averages, the sense that we've cracked the code, right? We can understand, we know how to sort of, any one poll might be off, but by averaging polls, we can sort of gain insight into the true outcomes. And then 2016 happens, where in retrospect, people debate, historically the polls weren't that off in the aggregate, but they were off in the places that mattered, right? And so the average final sort of total vote roughly predict, the polling averages roughly predict Clinton's sort of victory in the popular vote. The polling averages roughly predict Clinton's sort of victory in the popular vote, but they miss Trump's strong support primarily among non-college educated white voters who were concentrated in key swing states where the electoral math turns out to this surprising election victory that no one saw coming. But fortunately for scholars and election forecasters, we could understand that, right? We could say our polls didn't wait for education because in the past education hadn't been that predictive of vote choice. Going forward, all our polls are going to wait for education. And the polling in the 2018 midterms was relatively effective, relatively on point. There wasn't a clear bias towards Democrats or Republicans. The outcomes were the polling average, the absolute error was relatively small, historically speaking. And so perhaps we'd solve that problem. And then 2020 happens, and we have sort of the worst polling miss since I think Reagan crushed Carter in the 1980 elections. And so that concern that the polls are fundamentally broken reemerged and was, I think, part of what was driving this narrative about the potential for a red wave, that we were going to get, the polls were missing, failing to capture this kind of core support among Republicans, among some group that we just couldn't reach, right? One of our best and brightest political scientists and public opinion scholars analyzing the 2020 election results issue a report from the American Association for Public Opinion Researchers where the sort of fundamental, like, we missed badly, and why we missed is, it's hard to say. It's hard to say because it's a fundamental non-response bias where we don't know who's not responding to our surveys. If we could survey them, we could tell you who they are, but we can't, right? And so I think the best arguments I've heard for this is sort of about a declining generalized trust in institutions, right? That leads people to sort of be less likely to take surveys, combined with the fact that we've got several students in the crowd. How many of you pick up your cell phone when it's an unregistered number? All right, well, you, sir, you are the ones taking our polls. The rest of you, right? And so polling absolutely is much harder, right? But I think, again, we're still counting votes, but if you look at the end results, from what I've seen, the initial kind of comparisons of polling estimates to the results we've seen in competitive states, is that the polls, if anything, the polling average is relatively small, or polling error is relatively small, about 2 percentage points, and biased against Democrats, right? Sort of overweighting the support that we would expect Republicans to do. Now, again, part of that was a slew of polls that kind of were released in those final weeks showing I'm a bad denizen of New York, Kathy Hochul, how do you say? Hochul, sorry. I grew up in New York, but it's been a while since I lived there. Right, was within a polling error difference of Lee Zeldin that she could lose that governor's race. And these were from sort of non-traditional pollsters, right? These were Trafalgar Group being the sort of most prominent among them, who had sort of feeling pretty good about themselves, right? After calling 2016 and 2020 and being, I think going forward, we will be much more skeptical of their secret sauce, right? Because they're not transparent. They don't tell you how they're doing this problem, right? And there are absolutely ways to sort of blend polls, to sort of, there are lots of innovations going on in polling to try and get to these hard to reach populations. But if you don't tell us how you're doing it, then we have to trust you. And when you miss that badly, we trust you less. So broadly, I think that last night was a good night for traditional polling, or at least it was not, if the polls had missed like they did in 2020, I think those concerns about is polling fundamentally broken, I think would be very hard to sort of dismiss, right? Or say, well, there's lots about 2020 that was crazy, right? It was a pandemic, people were staying at home, Democrats were more likely perhaps to stay at home. There's lots of reasons we could sort of spin out stories for why the polls missed as badly as they did. Polling in general, when Trump has been on the ballot, has been hard, right? And so what that means going forward, I'm not sure we're out of the woods yet going forward for 2024. We'll talk more about that shortly. 2 minutes, 3 minutes? But I think in general, the reports of the demise of polling are probably greatly over-exaggerated, or at least it's not dead yet. I think that should you believe the polls, any one poll, I mean, probably not. Should you believe the forecasts? The forecasts have done reasonably well, and I would sort of say that that is my preferred way to sort of look at elections and election polling. Yeah, so, and then broadly, one last sort of, Catherine brought up this point. I think in general, last night was a reasonably good night for diversity, 12 female governors. It is certainly not as representative or as diverse as our population as a whole, but it is trending in the right direction, which is encouraging. And what that means going forward, I think, is important, something I think will be interesting to see in 2024. All right, what does this mean for the next Congress? I think my understanding I study political behavior. I'm no expert like Wendy, but my guess would be if you had to sort of say like how productive will the 118th Congress be, I would expect a lot of gridlock. Does that seem reasonable? I would say that if we get a divided House, or even if we get sort of unilateral, a slim majority, a slim Republican control, that I don't expect big things to happen. Now, this can be a good thing in some sense, right? It preserves some of those significant legislative achievements of the first part of the Biden administration, that if you're a supporter of the sort of Inflation Reduction Act's efforts on climate change, then the idea that those would be repealed seems less likely. Likely preserves, protects support for abortion, or prevents the possibility of these kind of enacting a nationwide ban. Similarly, I think it has implications for sort of ongoing for foreign policy, for support for Ukraine. I think the one place where I think it really does matter, control of the Senate, comes in judicial appointments. Right, that I think that if Republicans can gain a majority, I don't suspect that Mitch McConnell will help any of Biden's appointments or speed those through. Another area that seems a perennial area of potential concern is the idea of a debt ceiling crisis. Right, this sort of every couple of years, our bill on our deficit and debt comes due, and we have to we have to raise the ceiling by statute, and periodically, traditionally Republicans drag their feet and say we're going to let the U.S. default, which would be bad for all sorts of reasons. Whether that happens this time, whether that threat they make actually good on, or whether I think depends a lot on how Kevin McCarthy sort of handles an unruly caucus. And so I think he would be the one I would watch first and foremost. I don't think this was the outcome he expected when he was booked a hotel room in a big sort of ballroom in D.C. to celebrate his new majority. And so I think, governing, I would guess it's probably governing sort of a 9-seat majority seems like the most likely outcome. Will be challenging, because I do think that there are sort of different constituencies within the Republican Party that he has to manage. There is this sort of for lack of a better word, this kind of MAGA caucus, the Marjorie Taylor Greene, Gonzo, people from Arizona, whose names escape me, mixed in with, I think, some of the pickups that Republicans made, particularly so again, I'm from upstate New York, some of these seats in upstate New York that were sort of redrawn with a special master to make them sort of more competitive. So also in Jen Kiggins in the VA, the 2nd District of Virginia, another pickup, right, where you have some of these swing districts who I think a lot of these candidates sort of ran on being a moderate. You know, think about like Alan Fung, had he been elected into office, like they ran on sort of their ability to kind of be a different kind of Republican. And to the extent that those sort of more centrist Republicans in swing states won, how do they toe the party line? Do they fall in step? Or do their electoral interests sort of force them to sort of perhaps cross party lines? Within the Senate, again, I think it's hard to know who the outcome player is, whether it's 50-50 versus 51-50, and who that veto player is, I think will be interesting. Whether it matters that much with a divided Congress remains to be seen. What does this mean for 2024? The last, I think, good night, bad night was, last night was a good night, I think, for Ron DeSantis. 20-point win in Florida. I am almost certain that he will run. I am almost certain that Trump will run, right? He's planning a big announcement. Perhaps it's a new social media company. But almost certainly that primary, I think, will be vicious, right? And I don't know who wins, and I don't know the consequence of that. Yeah, so thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you very much. And now to comment, especially on the Senate and the future of what can happen there, we have our resident expert, Professor Richard Arenberg.
Thanks, Wendy. It's it's a difficult thing to follow 3 very insightful analysts. It, brings to mind the old expression that everything's been said. It's just not everybody said it yet. So I'll try to say it, and I'll try to add a little bit around the edges, and I'll try to be quick so that we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Okay. I think this was a very remarkable election. I think James Madison's probably giving out a sigh of relief today. I think this election can be characterized as a victory for democracy. I think that it's pretty clear that if you were an election denier, you probably got beat last night. And I think that's, given the fears we had going into this election, I'm not saying we should let up on the vigilance or anything like that, but I think it was a very positive outcome. And it's remarkable, given that this is an off-year election, high levels of inflation, the first-term president, as we know, usually his party loses a bunch of seats in the House of Representatives, 40, 50, 60. This one looks more like 15 or maybe even fewer. That's a remarkable thing. And I think it's a victory for democracy. I think it's a loss for Donald Trump. I think it's a victory for Biden, even though everybody's been quick to point out how anemic his approval ratings are, although most presidents at this stage have pretty anemic approval ratings. But, you know, a lot of people talked about all the places that Biden would not go to campaign because he was so unpopular. And in fact, he did go out on the road. And in fact, the only state in which there's been a pickup of a seat by a party is Pennsylvania, where Obama and Biden wrapped things up in a very memorable fashion. So I think it's a victory for Biden. As has already been said, it's a big victory for DeSantis. I think, given the evidence of last night, we can no longer consider Florida a worthwhile battleground state in the 24 election. You've got to face up to the fact that it's ruby red. I mean, Miami-Dade County, one of the most reliable blue counties in all of Florida, where Democrats used to run up the vote and then try to hold out while the rest of the state came in and returns came in. It went Republican last night, and it didn't do Biden any favors 2 years ago. So I think Florida's moved beyond the pale. And just a word about the issues. You know, it's interesting about this crime issue on which enormous amounts of money were spent by Republican candidates in the close of the campaign. If you saw many of the ads around the country, the Republican ads were almost exclusively about crime in the final days, very scary ads and everything. If you look at the exit poll data, crime did not move up to that level of concern from the voters. And abortion was right up there with the economy. And, you know, a lot of the professional, Democratic professional class, campaign professionals, were scolding Democratic candidates and saying, well, you know, your focus on abortion's been too exclusive, and this is not going to work. You know, the momentum for the abortion issue has kind of petered out. Maybe the court overturned Roe too early, and the reaction peaked. But in fact, it was formidable last night, not only on the referendum specifically about abortion, but in terms of what was driving Democratic votes. So all of that said, what's the impact on the House and the Senate? We've already said the House victory for the Republicans, and I think they will get a majority in the House, but it will be relatively small, something on the order of 10 votes. And this has a profound effect on the House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives is a majoritarian body. And the Speaker, he or she can basically do whatever they want with the House. I always like to say, understanding the House of Representatives is just knowing who has the keys to the bulldozer. However, there's a caveat on that. To be an effective Speaker, to exercise that kind of control that you have over that body, you need to be able to keep your caucus behind you. In other words, you need to line up your votes. And that's easier for Speaker McCarthy if his caucus is large. If he has a large advantage over the Democrats, that's much easier. He's got a cushion to work with. But with this narrow margin, he's going to be whipsawed constantly by the, they call themselves the Freedom Caucus, but it's I don't like to call them hyper-conservatives because they're now hyper-Trumpists, and much of what makes them Trumpists is not particularly all that conservative. But McCarthy's going to struggle with that mightily. We saw it with the previous two Republican speakers. Boehner, remember, was basically run out of the House. And this is going to be very difficult for McCarthy. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was already mentioned. This is amazing to think about, but she's going to be a power player in the House going forward. She raises an enormous amount of money. She gets a lot of attention. If you went out in the streets and asked people an open-ended question, how many members of the House of Representatives can you name? Probably they could name Pelosi, AOC, and Marjorie Taylor Greene. So she's right up there in the big three already. But I think that McCarthy, in order to have any leverage at all with his caucus in the House, he's going to have to keep her very close. And so she's not only going to get her committee assignments back, she may be squeezed into leadership somewhere. She may be given a committee from which she can do investigations or whatever, but she's going to be a big player. The other things that having the majority in the House will permit them to do, legislation was mentioned already, and I think it's probably a given that we won't see a lot of really significant legislation out of the Trump administration because it's going to be difficult to get anything through the House. And if the Senate flips over, then it becomes even worse, and we'll get to the Senate in a minute. But so the first thing is a kind of slowdown of and maybe even a stoppage of the Biden agenda for the next 2 years while the presidential election rages. There'll be a considerable number of investigations. The Republicans have been making long lists about what they want to look into, starting with Hunter Biden's laptop, but there's a lot of other things, and interestingly enough, they've already said they want to impeach Joe Biden. What they're going to impeach him for is to be announced. We don't know yet. They don't know yet. But they're pretty sure they're going to have an impeachment.
5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll wrap it up real quick. The last thing I wanted to say about the House, even if it's just the House, is there is going to be an enormous battle over the budget and the debt ceiling. We're going to have at least 2 opportunities to have in the next year, to have a big shutdown scare. And if it's on the debt ceiling, it will frighten the leaders of economies all over the world. And it's going to be a game of chicken that's going to be very difficult to turn away from. And the Republicans have already telegraphed that what they want to use that leverage for is to make cuts in Social Security and Medicare. Clinton, the last time that got this close, Clinton was very successful in protecting them, but it's always a danger. And then quickly, there's 2 things I want to mention about the Senate. It looks as though we'll have a 50-50 Senate. Don't sleep on the difference between a 50-50 Senate and a 51-50 Senate, because when the Senate is 50-50, and this will be the 3rd one now in a couple of decades. Typically, there's an agreement made between the majority and the minority, and the majority doesn't have quite as much command over what goes on in the Senate as it does if they have a real majority, 51-50, because then the membership of the committees is not 50-50 equalized. They're able to report legislation out of the committees just on a one-party basis. So it makes a big difference whether it's 50-50 or 51-50, and both of those things are in play, as is a 51-50 advantage for the Republicans. If you're a Democrat, that would be disastrous. Over and above the things I listed for the House of Representatives, it was mentioned earlier that one of the big areas would be judicial nominations, and that's true. The Republicans, Mitch McConnell, would slow down those nominations. In addition, not only would they be slowed down, but Biden would begin to realize that in order to get nominations confirmed, particularly at the circuit court level, he's going to have to deal with the Republicans. He's going to need some Republican votes, or he won't be able to get them confirmed. And that will lead him on the front end when he's choosing his nominees. It will lead him to look for nominees who are more moderate, who are more likely to be able to attract a handful of Republican votes.
We have 1 minute left.
Okay, well, that's good, because there's one additional thing. Well, first, on the judges, I just want to mention the Supreme Court, because if there is another opening in these next 2 years, you can count on Mitch McConnell to block them. So we will not see another Biden confirmed judge to the Supreme Court unless and until a Democrat is elected in 2024. So, and that of course is a very unfortunate thing. It's basically unconstitutional in my judgment, but it's pretty well now established after the Gorsuch and Coney Barrett nominations, that the majority gets to play games with the timing of how these Supreme Court nominations go through. And then the last aside that I wanted to make, and then I actually will come to a complete stop, is those of you who know me know that I'm obsessed by the question of the filibuster in the Senate. And I just want to make the observation that irrespective now of who controls the Senate, the filibuster, in my judgment, is safe, because with Republicans in charge of the House of Representatives, it'd be very difficult to get the entire Democratic caucus to get behind a change, an elimination of the filibuster, when they then can't move the legislation anyway because the House is able to block it. I'm done.
So we have about 7 or 8 minutes for questions, and I wanted to also tell people that we will be having a couple of events at the Taubman Center that you'll have an opportunity to discuss the impact of the midterms. Tom Perez, the former chair of the Democratic National Committee, will be with us on Monday, November 21st. For Politics and Policy Lunch at the Taubman Center from 12 to 1 in Stephen Robert Hall. So you can join us there, free lunch, and Tom Perez, and we'll be talking all about continuing this conversation. And Congressman David Cicilline will be joining us on December 5th to talk about changes in the House and Senate, also at the Politics and Policy Lunch on Mondays in Stephen Robert Hall. So I encourage you, if you can't stay now and you still have questions, to come to those two things. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? Yes, sir.
My question is about ticket splitting, because the margins are Wisconsin especially. Has it become more so now? Is it going to be a trend going forward, do you think?
So the question's about ticket splitting and will it become a trend, or, what did this election tell us about ticket splitting when a voter chooses to vote for one candidate from one party at one level of office and then votes for a candidate from a different party for a different level of office? Who wants to take that?
I'll
Okay,
offer
Paul.
a quick thought, which was my sense of the literature on ticket splitting was that it had been historically in decline, that elections had been much more nationalized, that the chance of, voting for a Republican governor and a Democratic senator, that had gone down. And today, and this past election was a departure from that trend. And so whether that continues going forward, I would expect in the general election for it to be even more nationalized, and so for that to not happen. But
Yeah, and it depends on whether
Yeah.
the ticket splitting was driven by a governor that was an incumbent, let's say, or a popular governor. So Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania was quite popular as Attorney General and ran a strong campaign, and he brought a Democratic senator with him. But in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson's an incumbent Republican senator who won re-election, and you had Tony Evers, who's an incumbent Democratic governor, who also had a following that was pretty strong. So I think you can see that in a state where people are willing to vote for different parties under that circumstance.
So just one quick follow-up. So then do you think that without having Kemp above him on the ticket, that Walker's going to have a harder time in a runoff?
Yes, somebody just said that to me, actually, as their prediction that, Kemp was a fairly popular candidate for governor for reelection in Georgia, and Herschel Walker struggled in the Republican Party with so didn't have the same level of popularity. Kemp certainly outperformed Walker. So you can argue that without Kemp, it's unclear how many Republicans will come out. It depends on the dynamics of what's going on with the Senate. It probably depends a little bit on Donald Trump. You could easily see Barack Obama going back to Georgia and Donald Trump going back to Georgia, maybe Biden going to Georgia. So, but without the governor, it's going to be a very different race. Yeah.
And the status of what the Georgia vote means in terms of control of the Senate will dictate a lot of that. If Arizona and Nevada split, and it comes down to Georgia for who's going to control the Senate, then I think all bets are off. And I think enormous amount of national money comes in, all of the national figures come in, and I think the focus becomes almost laser certain on the question of who controls the Senate.
Yeah, it's only
And
12
so
days
the
after Thanksgiving, though.
The character issues about, about the Republican candidate won't matter so much.
However, I was going to say, and I'm sorry to interrupt, was that it's only 12 days after Thanksgiving. It's December 6th. It's not January. So the runoff in 21 was January. Gave a lot more time for mobilization and fundraising. This is going to be a shorter clock. December 6th is also, for students in my class, an important day for them to remember. But it's also, it's important to think about the short window for this runoff in terms of happening in December rather than January. So it has implications across the board. So we have time for one more question. Yes, in the back.
I'm curious about, obviously not everything in Georgia has been elucidated yet, but I'm curious about the, quote unquote, Stacey Abrams playbook, the idea of voter turnout as opposed, and, registering new voters as opposed to voter persuasion, which obviously in Stacey Abrams' case didn't work out, and the O'Rourke case didn't necessarily work out. I'm wondering if you think that will have any effect on the approach to voter turnout versus voter persuasion, say, in this runoff or in 2024.
It's an excellent question. I'm not taking it. Professor Collins or Professor Tate, you want to take?
I think that the early work suggested that minorities weren't really hurt that badly by the new voter restrictive laws that states passed. But I think that the failures of those two candidacies, people are going to return to the data, and it'll take years before we really get an answer. I think that, just as a personal side, I voted by mail, and I made a mistake, actually, with my ballot. It was returned to me fortunately in time, so I could, correct it and then send it out. So I think that these are, it's just with all the, signatures required. Arizona wants you to put down your driver's license number. I think that these are serious barriers that may have affected the outcome in 2022. So, but right now, it'll take us a while before we could get an answer.
I wouldn't draw a negative inference from Stacey Abrams losing that rate. I mean, you can give her credit for Biden's victory in Georgia, the victory of the 2 senators in Georgia, the fact that Georgia is now moving into becoming a purple state. It's the tremendous work that she and her organization have done in adding people to the rolls in Georgia. I think it's very important. I mean, it didn't put her over the top in this particular election. Kemp turned out to be a very popular governor, and he had the additional advantage that for people who had the distaste for Trump had, had this very public fight with Kemp over the 2020 count in Georgia. And so Kemp was kind of a hero for some of the anti-Trump people too, particularly those that were Republicans, came out for him.
Thank you. Professor Collins, you want the last word?
Oh, the only thing I was going to add to that, to the comments about Abrams and O'Rourke, is just that the degree of difficulty was also just extremely high for them. They're running in gubernatorial elections in states that don't elect Democratic governors. And so, again, I wouldn't throw baby out with bathwater and make any overarching claims about the weakness of voter registration and mobilization around getting more folks registered to vote. If anything, you could argue that they outperformed what they were supposed to do by even being competitive in those races.
On that note, I'm going to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, our panelists, Professor Collins, Professor Tate, Professor Arenberg, and Professor Testa. Thank you very much.